Hello and welcome to another episode of A Coffee with Chris. As always, in association with Big C, Norfolk's cancer charity, who help local people affected by cancer, and proudly sponsored by Hill Coaching Company, here to help you become a better version of yourself today. Now, I'm always excited to welcome a guest, but I'm particularly excited to welcome this guest. I actually can't believe I've bagged him, considering the journey he's been on in recent years. His name is Colin Campbell, and if you don't know him, he is the host of a top 1% podcast, congrats, called Cambro Conversations, a podcast where you learn how to pursue the best version of yourself across different areas of your life with weekly discussions with people that practice what they preach. Cole, welcome to A Coffee with Chris.
Chris, great to be here, and another full circle moment. You and I have gone back and forth on podcasts so many times now, and I'm ready for another classic.
It's so lovely, and the whole reason why I love talking with you, Col, is we share the same conviction in making sure that we share as much value as possible and giving people tangible takeaways. So let's kick it off straight away, my friend, with introduce the world of podcasting, because this is what this conversation is all about today. Why should business owners, why should thought leaders care about podcasting?
There's a number of strands to it. And the first that springs to mind, and I think is important to hit on, is that it's now the ultimate personal brand tool. And that is you holding yourself up, as you say, as a thought leader in your sector, talking about what your business does, how you meet different customer bases' needs, what you know about the sector. And it's a very soft sell, because you go on for an hour a week or an hour every fortnight or half an hour, whatever format your show's in, and you just deliver without asking. And over time, you build a tremendous connection with people, because if you think about your audience's commitment to you versus a TikTok, versus a YouTube short, versus an Instagram reel, versus even a tweet or a LinkedIn post, they're having to invest quite a lot of time to hear you and listen to you. And I'm sure many people have heard this before, that there needs to be a set number of contacts or hours before somebody chooses to work with you or buy from you. And some people argue it's 11 hours, some people argue it's more, some people argue it's less. But with a podcast, you quite quickly accumulate those hours and you build a connection with your listenership that you cannot get from almost any other medium. And I honestly view podcasts as the new printing press. And I believe that the way that society is wired at the moment, where we consume a lot of our information on our phones, on our laptops, it's quite quickly becoming a medium that's overtaking things like newspapers, things like traditional media. I know, for example, I go to the Joe Rogan podcast or some other podcasts like Trigonometry for takes on what's happening politically. And I don't instead consume things like BBC News, Sky News. I prefer to hear from people in a more, I would call it, free speech, open platform, and you're able to hear them go back and forth. So I believe podcasts they're still young, they're still new, but we are developing at a rate that is having more and more influence on the people that listen to them.
So good, Cole. Totally with you on that. I think business owners are struggling to realize how it works with them. I think there's this challenge where there's almost this stigma that it's all about just people that want to become influencers, as opposed to people that actually want to provide value, that want to build brands, to sell products and services, etc., etc. Insanely powerful tool for business. Cole, I know that you've had Daniel Priestley on your podcast, which, congratulations, massive guest, very well-known chap. And one of the phrases that Daniel Priestley says quite often, actually, is that the pendulum always swings the other way. And with this short form video world that we're in, with TikTok, with YouTube shorts, with Instagram reels, etc., my world of social media, it's so fast paced that actually then there is this hunger and desire. And now actually it's being rewarded by the platforms if you produce and execute and create and curate long form content. Would you agree with that?
I would agree entirely. And Daniel applies that phrase to many different settings, but in particular around content. And there has always been an appetite among a set demographic to listen to things for a longer period, to get more information, to get more depth. And ultimately, I know that with my short form that I put out there, I'm using that as a lead, a generator to drive towards the long form. So you have to play the game in some regards, of course you do. But when people come across, they want to be informed, they want to be educated, they want to be entertained. One of the frameworks that you taught me back in the day when we were growing our social medias together was around, if I post something and put it out into the world, does it achieve one of those 3 or 4 things in terms of information, entertainment, motivation, inspiration, whatever term you want to use? It needs to achieve something like that. So when I think about creating that long form content, it's still within those same brackets, but it's just delivered in a medium that people are almost craving, because they are so saturated with the shorter form, snappier, more limbically hijacking content that is so readily available.
I'm flattered that I've taught you something that stayed with you, Cole. Thank you. Let's talk about starting a podcast for those people that know podcasts are powerful, right? And then they start it, and then it goes wrong. So why does it go wrong when people start a podcast? And what things would you suggest, Cole, to prevent a podcast from failing?
Much like anything in life, I think you need to be very clear on your why. And that becomes cliched. I'm actually rallying against people saying, oh, that's cliched, because a lot of the reason why phrases are cliched is because they've been proven to be true over and over and over again. So for me, understanding why you would want to undertake the mission of your podcast is absolutely vital, and making sure that those reasons are not just surface level. Don't get me wrong, I've loved the opportunity to speak to Daniel Priestley, to fly to Dubai, to fly to Marbella, to fly to London to record episodes. That feels really cool, but it's not the underlying why. I love having conversations that allow people to learn more about how to optimize in different areas of their life, whether that's brain, body, business. And I do that just over and over and over again for many, many years without some of the external rewards that are coming now. I was rinsing and repeating the process early on. So understanding why you're doing it and making sure that there's a level of longevity to that why, and it's not an immediate quick win, because while you may well see immediate success, whether that's revenue generating, whether that's network improvement, whether that's personal brand improvement, whether that's positioning yourself as a thought leader in your sector, that may come very early. It may come within 3, 4, 5 episodes. Yeah. But for many of you who attempt to start a podcast, it will come later, and the delayed gratification will be worthwhile. So you must have a level of patience, and you must have a level of longer time horizons on what your why is. So your why may well be that you want to establish yourself in your industry as somebody that knows what they're talking about and wants to generate customers, but making sure that that comes over a longer period and you actually enjoy the medium as well. Like, so for example, a client comes to you, Chris, you will assess what their skill set is and what their appetite is for content. So it might be that they produce a lot more video content because they want to be on YouTube. It might be they hate the idea of video content. So guess what? They're going to write a lot of posts for LinkedIn. They're going to repurpose that to Twitter, into a thread, whatever else that is, and lean into what you see yourself being good at. For me, I loved having conversations as a guest on a podcast initially, but also in my sales career, I would interview and have conversations with managing directors, financial directors, operations directors, and I was able to hold my own and direct a conversation and pursue an agenda and bring forward a set of solutions. That was a very transferable skill. So when it comes to those early days of starting a podcast, understand what you care about, why, and what you intend to do with it, but also you don't necessarily have to be the finished article, and by any means go back and listen to some of my early episodes. There was mistakes. However, you must have some sort of raw skill set that is moldable from the start to move towards it, and you see yourself doing it. If you're somebody that really hates doing video calls, really hates speaking to a camera, you probably need to do some reps in the background before you expose yourself in public first.
Bang on. Preach it, my friend. I'm so with you on so many points. Just a couple of things I can pull out from that is the enjoyment factor, which sounds pretty fluffy, but it's so obvious to the consumer of that content when you're not in it with pure passion and you're doing it to give value, to help people. And yes, of course, there's byproducts of starting a podcast that come your way tenfold in, 3, 4, 5 years time. And you're starting to, feel the benefits of that now yourself, Cole. But it is about that long game. It's such a good thing if you are already a patient person and you've got that, investing mindset where you're investing in your future. Podcasts are totally for you. But I love what you said there, Colin. It's so right. I feel that this is a good time to lead on to my next point, which is that when I'm advising clients on this, Cole, when we're running their socials and they're saying, right, we want to start a podcast, Chris, and I'd say the same things as you. And one of the things they say is, right, what gear do I need? What about the guests? And I feel like, Cole, maybe they're distracted by the technology and not necessarily the what, the why, the how. And I guess this is a roundabout way of saying, how the hell did you grow a podcast from where you grew it to with that dodgy old mic, not the mic that you've got now? I remember it. How did you grow it from that to a top 1% podcast, beating some of the big boys in the podcasting game? How did you do that?
I think for starters, You mentioned the dodgy mic, the home setup. Now, obviously, I'm in a home setup just now, but the audio quality and the video quality is excellent because I've invested in that.
Mm-hmm.
But I had to have an element of proving the concept to myself first, because that allows you to then invest further. If, for example, you're somebody that is worried about the startup costs in terms of the mic, the camera, if you're recording remotely, of course, that's the kind of key box to tick. But if you're recording in a studio, there's obviously upfront costs to pay to a studio to produce it for you, or you can create your own setup. Sometimes you just need to start to iterate on that over time. And momentum is a hell of a drug. I know that when I started to enjoy it, you were episode 4 on the podcast. Episode 1 was Chris Williamson, of all people. I was able to just start with momentum and move forward because I was enjoying the process. I loved the feedback I was getting from the audience because it felt more than just surface level. Like back in the day when I was posting on Instagram and I grew my audience using mostly my physique and my diet insights. Getting told you look sick, bro, feels fine. But being told like, oh, I listened to that episode with Chris Reeve and I learned this about how to position myself on social media, or I listened to that episode with Chris Williamson, I learned about sobriety and I learned about investing in houses so that I could further my portfolio in other areas and use that investments to build a business that I cared about. All these different lessons and messages that you get feel so good, and they are the fuel on the fire that keep you going in those early days where maybe the numbers aren't comparative to some of the people, like you say, the big boys out there that you know are doing hundreds, tens of thousands of downloads an episode, and you're getting a couple hundred to get started, and that feels good. And don't get me wrong, there's many shows out there that start and never get above the tens or whatever. But what keeps you going in those early days is you start, you iterate, you choose little areas to improve on, you listen back to game tape and you remove some of the filler words. And guess what? That transfers over into your working life, your career, where you're able to be like, oh, I'm actually more articulate now. I don't as much. I pause, I listen better. I'm more interactive and I'm more thoughtful. I bring up lessons that I've learned from previous podcasts to the guest and put it forward and put in and get them to explain what they mean by that. And I really think there's a lot of intangible things that you learn in those early days that kind of allow you to continue and improve and just over time get better and better and better, whether that's better guests, whether that's better equipment, whether that's better questions that you ask, whether that's better research that you do. So for me, Chris, in terms of that growth period, I had to start, I had to get momentum, I had to keep going. And then from there, I had to be really, really, and I'm not going to say self-critical, but I had to assess really quite ruthlessly, what can I be better? What could I do better? And then there's the whole Kaizen concept, 1% better every single day. I could just identify, where can I improve? Where can I get better?
Yes.
Honestly, can I say when I put out that episode that it was perfect? Of course not. I still don't do that. I'm 250 episodes in, 251 went out this morning. And there's little things where I think, oh, I keep saying fascinating in that episode. I probably need to not say that as often. Okay, cool. That's another area for me to improve on.
But don't you find, Cole, that a lot of the things that you think you're worried about when you're doing a podcast, the listener doesn't give a crap. They just don't care, do they? They just do not care on so many points. So I think that's interesting. I just find, Cole, that so many conversations I have with my clients about podcasting is they think it's this unattainable thing because they need to spend 10 grand on camera equipment, and they don't. And I say this all the time, and the listeners of Coffee with Chris will go, oh, here we go, Chris is saying it again. It's all about execution over perfection. And if you can just get yourself into that with not just podcasting, but your social media content as well, and do the reps, like Cole said, is fantastic advice.
Just on that, Chris, you mentioned getting started on social media and like spending 10 grand on camera equipment. There is the opportunity to, if you start an audio only podcast, you and I both know Matt Sykes very well. I just went on Matt's show recently and we spoke about podcasting and sales and all the things that I love to talk about. And Matt, up until episode 70 something, however many he's on, has been primarily an audio only podcast. Now that's fine and it might get you started, but I told him off and I said that video is the top of the content pyramid.
Me too.
And you know this better than most. So for example, we're going to record this today. It's going to go out as video on LinkedIn and YouTube. But guess what? We pull that video down, we turn it into clips, which can go on YouTube Shorts, which can go on TikTok, which can go on Instagram Reels. We can actually get a transcript from it and we can turn it into an email for our newsletter. We can turn it into a LinkedIn post. We can turn it into a Twitter thread. Podcasting is amazing for people who want to start to grow across other platforms because you can distill down the top level at the very foundation all the way down to all these different areas.
And also, if you're a business owner and you're short on time, Carl, because as you say, it's at the top of the content pyramid, or as Callum Howard said in our Coffee with Chris last week, he actually referred to the content pyramid as a content oak tree, because it starts from these roots and then it goes up through the actual core of the tree and into the branches, and it keeps going and it keeps going and it keeps going. And that is the power of podcasting. Cole, the power of podcasting, of course, as we've already said on multiple times in this, is guests. And I feel like guests can make or break a podcast. What's the secret of sourcing guests, of finding guests, of how do you get the best ones? Do you have to pay to get the best guests?
I can hand on heart say that I've never paid a single guest out of the 250 episodes that I've been on and that I've released. There's guests on there that you would be really impressed by, whether it's Daniel Priestley, whether it's Chris Williamson, whether it's 𝗖𝗵𝗿𝗶𝘀, whether it's Simon Thomas, lots of different people on there that are all amazing. There's so many different routes to getting guests. My sales background has played a massive role in how I approach them. But in terms of finding them, I think there's a number of different areas. There's, of course, the people that you follow on social media within your niche that you think are interesting. LinkedIn is a fantastic place for that. Instagram, Twitter, wherever else. See those people who are showing up. Look at people who've released a book or are due to release a book in an area you care about as well, because guess what? Authors, instead of going on book tours nowadays, they go on a podcast tour. And that is something that you'll see throughout my archive. We were even speaking before we hit record. Cassie Holmes came on my show. She's an American author about a book on time management. And Cassie did the rounds on, quote unquote, the big shows. And I managed to get her on because it was in her interest to reach my demographic of audience who are interested in improving their time management, improving how they spend their time, being more cognizant about it. And that is a great place to look, whether that's Amazon, whether that's other podcasts that are in your niche that are releasing with these authors, because they'll quite quickly be keen to do that as well. You can, of course, look at other podcasts and previous guests that have been on their shows as well, of course, while remaining true to your podcast and its mission and not trying to be the B-Tech or the Aldi or the Costco version, knockoff version of somebody else's show. You can certainly look for inspiration. So, for example, in my field, I could look at Modern Wisdom. And if, for example, he's got on a particular guest who talks about a particular topic, maybe I can't reach that guest at this moment in time, but I can find somebody else who speaks about that topic, who is credible on social media, who's credible and has good video content or is well articulated. And I can approach them and get them on. So I may not be able to get the exact same guest, but I can get somebody who's in that niche. So I'm always getting inspiration from socials, from authors, and from other podcasts that are in my space.
I love the point of authors. I didn't even think about that, Cole. That's very obvious. I'm like, and that links to my point, which is like, there's got to be something in it for them, right? And I think so often when people are approaching guests for podcasts, they make it all about them and their podcast and not about what the guest could get out of it as well. And I think that's quite important. I find it amazing, Cole, that you've never paid a guest, including some of those names that you've mentioned is phenomenal. So I'm gonna challenge you a bit further on that, Cole. Like, what is the secret? What are you saying to them? How are you persuading them to come on?
Again, this comes from my sales background, where I've been a sales director I've been working in sales for a decade now, Chris, making me feel a little bit old, but it's taught me an awful lot. I have an outbound template, which is called the 3 Whys. And the first why is why you. So if I'm writing to Chris Reeve, for example, I will write something about why I think you would be a good guest for my podcast, whether it's a piece of content I've seen you produce, whether it's a piece of expertise that you have that will fit my audience. And as you said, somebody will write and be like, my podcast, I could be like, my podcast in the top 1% globally. It gets X number of downloads per week. And that's fine. That can come later. But people love to hear about what you find valuable at them. Everyone's favorite topic, themselves, or the one that is at least the one they know the best anyway. And so when I'm starting my email, when I'm starting my LinkedIn message, when I'm starting my Instagram DM, whatever platform I'm reaching out on, I start with why you, and I'm extremely specific. I don't just say love your content, because that is generic. I need to personalize it. And you know yourself, when you get outbound, you will filter the ones that show they've made an effort that's above the standard. And guess what? The standard's really fucking shit. So you're going to be absolutely fine. You're going to be able to stand out quite quickly. I don't know if I'm allowed to swear on LinkedIn, but we've done it. Anyway, I start with why you. So if it's an author, I'll be like, I really enjoyed reading How to Maximize Your Time, Happier Hour. The key things that I learned were X, Y, and Z. I would love to have a conversation with you on my podcast to share that with my audience, who are primarily, and I'll share some of the demographics. The next part of the why is why me. So this is all about, who I am, what my podcast brings to the table, why it's important. So that'll be things like audience demographic. That'll be things like downloads. In the early days, you don't need to share that because it's not going to be impressive, but talk about what your podcast stands for, what it's all about, what the mission is as well. You and I both know David McIntosh really well. He produces a podcast called the Development by David podcast. He recently interviewed Jimmy Carr. That is unbelievable. Guess what? In his Why Me section, he spoke about the mission of the podcast from an origin story perspective, how he's into stand-up comedy, how inspired he is by Jimmy. He talked about the loss of his mum, which again is a conversation that you both had, which is still something that I look back on really fondly in terms of a piece of content that I've consumed. And it made a personal connection on why him. It wasn't just my podcast gets X number of views, I have this number of subscribers. That's important. And there will be people that respond well to the figures and the data side of things. And you can include that, but include the mission, include what it's going to do. And then, of course, the final part of the three whys equation is why now? And that is some sort of call to action, whether it is, I have good availability on the following dates. Would you like to come to the studio in whatever city? Or would you like to record over StreamYard or Riverside or whatever platform you use? And then suggest some dates. You need to make things easy for people. You cannot just say, it'd be great to host you on the podcast. Let me know how your diary looks, because that's too fluffy. I also will say, and some people will bristle at this, do not send a calendar link. I strongly disagree with people who send a calendar link. If I'm reaching out to somebody cold to invite them on my podcast, I'm going to be flexible to book them in. I'm not going to be like, I'm available, book yourself a slot in. I think that's the wrong dynamic to try and achieve. Maybe if you've had a bit of back and forth and they say, have you got a link? Fine, but do not lead with a calendar link. You will rub somebody up the wrong way. If somebody does that to me and I'm by no means a superstar, I will tell them to chase himself.
I love that. Oh, there's so much there. I love the why system there that you've got, and perhaps linked to that, I wonder if you've maybe got a process. I don't really like that word. It's a bit. I don't like this word, blueprint. But I wonder if there's something that you would perhaps encourage people that are starting a podcast, that run a podcast, to use in terms of their prep, in terms of their questions. Because the reason why I love Cambro Conversations is the amount you get out of a guest. And it just seems like with every passing minute, I not only learn more, but I become more deeply connected with the guest. Like it's never this, it doesn't feel like a Ponzi show off thing where we're just like rubbing each other's egos. With your podcast, you seem to get so much out of guests. So again, Cole, what is the secret with that?
One of the things that I think is so important is that you show respect to your guest by doing your research in advance and don't have any questions that are immediately obvious. So, for example, I wouldn't say, Chris, tell me what it's like to work in social media management, or tell me what it's like to consult somebody on their personal brand. It's too vague. Be a bit more specific. Be like, Chris, you've gained a lot of expertise now in managing socials. What do you see about this? What do you see about that? And ask something a bit more specific. And for me, research is a fundamental part of that. That could be listening to previous episodes that guests done. If they're not somebody that's super experienced in the podcast space, that's fine. Go onto their social media, go through the posts that they create and they share. What are they passionate about talking about? And what do you see them as somebody that can contribute value about? And go quite deep on that. I will have relatively good notes on that ready, whether that's in front of me in the studio or whether that's at the side of my laptop or on a notepad when I'm recording virtually. And I don't script my questions, but I have open-ended questions and open-ended topics that I believe I will cover across the episode. For example, when you and I were getting arranged for this, there were some broad areas that you thought would be most valuable to your audience, and you shared those with me in advance. Some of my guests will ask for that, some will not. Some will ask for something more rigorous than that. There's guys, for example, that have maybe been through a big financial exit from a company, or they're maybe getting investors in, and they need to be quite careful about what they say and what they cover. And that for me enables me to go deeper in my research, and I prep really, really hard. There's lots of different areas that I look. So social media is one, previous podcast interviews. If they've written blogs, if they've written articles, if they've written books, that's massive. I will ask connections of theirs. This is something that I spoke about with you before, Chris. You'll sometimes, I think you've approached like, and this sounds dodgy, but we'll roll with it. You've approached like footballers' wives and girlfriends to ask them about questions that might resonate with them. And you can do that on a deeper level if you've got somebody that's mutually following them, or that's connected with them. If you go on their tagged photos on Instagram, you can see who's friends with them as well. And that was a Chris Reeve special. And I really, really value asking them something that makes them go, oh, how did you, and I'll front load it. So like, for example, I love the feeling of when a guest goes, oh, how did you know that? Because once you get that reaction, they're going to share on a deeper level. And that is always the aim of my show. Get them to go below skin level, below surface level, and go that little bit deeper. Because guess what? The listeners, as you were saying, they're like, wow, they shared a lot more on Cambro than they did on whatever other show you heard them on. And that's a mark of, touch wood, my hosting ability and what I've done beforehand. The private victories are really what count when it comes to the public show and podcasting.
Yes, I'm with you. It really does go that extra step beyond, doesn't it? And even if you think about this cynically, right? Even if you're like, oh, you know, I want the guest to be comfortable, I want the guest to open up. But even if you're like, I want numbers, I want engagement, then you should think about your questions, because if you ask a question that is linked to something that hasn't been spoken about before, that's going to be a headline. You know, that could be something that the press pick up potentially if they've never spoken about it before. I know that David McIntosh did a fantastic job with Jimmy Carr, for example, where, you know, a couple of bits and pieces then got disseminated across the traditional press as well. So I'm totally with you on the questions, Cole. The other thing I do, and I'm not sure if you do this, but I'm also forward thinking about future guests with my questions for an existing one. For example, I will ask a footballer about one of their mates in the team back in 2008 who I want on the podcast. And then what I do is I use that as a clip within my pitch to that person and say, oh, your pal back in 2007, he actually mentioned you on a podcast. Oh, by the way, do you want to then respond to that? And then that's actually a great way of doing it. So again, totally validate all of that, Cole. And even in a business sense as well, please think about your questions. Please think about your prep. Get specific. I think that's fantastic advice.
Just on that, Chris, before we move on, that is a perfect way to bulk out your why you section. So you can validate who you are as a host by not just name dropping, but also explaining who you've spoken to previously that's in their network. So by me saying to Daniel Priestley that I'd spoken to Chris Williamson, that I'd spoken to 𝗖𝗄𝗄𝗲𝗲, that I'd spoken to whoever I knew was in his circle, I was able to link to those podcasts, and he can be like, okay, this guy is actually the real deal. And I actually appreciate who he is and what he stands for, rather than just maybe like, oh, I really loved your books about 𝗖𝗵𝗿𝗶𝘀. Like that, it's not quite the same. So I love that you've been able to bulk out your outbound to future guests by using the resources that you've created from previous, and that is a very circular approach. So one episode continues to feed the next, continues to feed the one after that.
And this further validates the points of the discussion a few minutes ago, Cole, around actually how it's really tough at the start, and it's really not sexy at the start, and it's really hard work at the start. But if you picture a snowball rolling down a hill, it gets bigger and bigger, doesn't it? And when it gets to the bottom, you can build a snowman with it. But at the start, it's like, blimmin' heck, is this going to crumble apart? But as it keeps going, you can use guests' questions to your advantage, can't you?
You need the processes and systems. Passion will get you started. So we're talking about the why earlier on. You might just be buzzing to have these conversations, and you'll come off those early podcasts like elated, especially if you're a little bit extroverted, or if you're somebody that just generally loves the topics that you're talking about, which I really hope that you should if you're going to start a podcast. But I think the big stumbling blocks are episode 3, episode 8, and episode 21. That's where the vast majority of people fall off. 90% don't make it past episode 8, and then a further 10% fail. 10% of those that make it past episode 8 fail by episode 21. I think episode 8 is because the process and systems just aren't there. They're just not able to have a good enough bank. They've not got a good enough bank of potential guests coming up. Maybe the editing side of things, maybe the production, the promotion just hasn't worked, or they just haven't seen the validation of, maybe they haven't got one that's gone viral, or one that's done 1,000 downloads versus 100, or whatever else your metrics are. Episode 21, I think, 1, it's your why runs out. 2, your process and systems aren't there. And 3, you just haven't got the validation or the excitement or the fiscal return that you were hoping for. And that for me is really short-sighted, because you and I both know, producing hundreds of podcasts over the last 4 or 5 years, you really need to be in it for the long game. And I believe in a phrase called increasing your surface area of luck. So by me releasing more episodes, I increase the surface area of luck for one popping off and going off. And guess what? When one goes off now with 250 episodes in the archive, guess what? My archive goes bananas. I've mentioned to you before, you've had messages, 3, 4 years after appearing
Yeah.
on my show, been like, listen to episode 4 with you. Loved when you said this. And guess what? That's because somebody came on episode 180 or episode 210 and it went mad. And then somebody went back in the archive and was like, I really enjoyed that Colin guy's podcast. Let me see who else he's had on, or let me see what topics interest me. So create an archive.
It kills me, Cole, and it's that classic. I'm sure that there's lots of analogies and visuals to represent this. The one that stands out in my mind is there's 2 gold miners, right? And they're in the tunnels, and they're both building the same tunnel going this way, right? And one gives up and goes back when he's just at the gold. And it's the exact same thing with podcasts, isn't it? All you need is one to go, and then the rest all follow. And the fact that someone has multiple people have contacted me back from episode 4 means they love your podcast that much that they've scrolled and scrolled and scrolled and scrolled and scrolled and scrolled to find me. So I think that's so true. Cole, I'm so aware of your time, my friend, and I'm genuinely so grateful and flattered that you've made the effort to come on. Now you're in the dizzy heights of top 1%. And what would you say are the key mistakes? Like, I know you said there that, when podcasts tend to stop, but what are the maybe 2 or 3 other key mistakes that businesses can avoid when it comes to their podcasts?
I would say have 5 episodes in the bank before you release episode 1, because when episode 1 comes out, there'll be a little bit more admin because it's the first time you release something in terms of the promotion, in terms of the distribution. So have others up your sleeve so that you're able to consistently build that. Because for me, having a consistent upload day and time is very, very important, because you become part of some of these habits and routines. If I think about my own podcast listening, there's particular podcasts I listen to on particular days doing particular activities, whether that's my morning walk on a Monday, whether that's my training session on a Tuesday, whatever it is. I have podcasts that I listen to based on the release and upload schedule. If you start to miss that, or you don't become consistent, you never give yourself the chance of being part of Dave or Sally's routine during the week because you release on a particular day. So for me, having a Sunday upload that I always meet, never missed, haven't missed it since the 1st of April 2020, has been absolutely key to becoming part of people's routine. Being sporadic is not helpful. So I would say have that consistent upload, have those 5 in the bank before you get started. Put aside time, and I call this like the dentist appointment, an hour a week. Now, don't get me wrong, people don't go to the dentist an hour a week, but treat it this way. Have it in your diary. It's a non-negotiable where you do outreach for an hour a week. You must send 10 to 15 messages during that time. And as your show grows, people will come back faster. They'll be more inclined. Maybe the people you're shooting at will have heard you before. Maybe they've listened to you before, or maybe they just recognize the opportunity that sits in front of them. But in those early days, out of 15, you might get 1 response. You might get no response. You might need to do a follow-up. So I have that in the diary as a non-negotiable where I outbound and I get in touch and I fill up my pipeline over and over and over again. Now, a lot of these behaviors are learned behaviors from a career in sales and selling lots and lots and lots of things over the years. But for me, having that there means I'm never empty. I'm never dry. I'm never scrambling on a Saturday for a Sunday upload. It just doesn't happen. I just do not let it happen. So having that there as a non-negotiable is a really, really big help. And there'll be times where you're almost, I would call it, overlaid with episodes to come in the future, but that's a great problem to have. You don't need to worry too much about that. And there's times when I double up and I have a Wednesday release and I have a Sunday release. But guess what? When the going gets tough and maybe somebody cancels on you, or you have a scheduling problem, or guess what? Life happens and you're outside of the podcasting world. You still have a backlog to ensure that you meet your commitment that you've made to your audience to deliver on a set day and a set time of a set standard.
Amazing. There's so much to gather from that. I'm going to add a top mistake as well, which I'm sure you would agree with, Cole. It really upsets me that there's some really super smart, intelligent people that are creating exceptional podcasts, right? And they film it and they record it and they publish it, but they don't promote it on, you guessed it, social media properly. So they're just throwing it out once and done, believe it or not, that is actually happening. But what about grabbing key quotes from the guests? What about grabbing different engaging clips? What about tagging the same guest 2 months later to then still get access to their network? What about downloading the transcription and using it as an article on your website? And the thing that blows my mind is, I said, I'm doing a podcast with a client, which I'll remain unnamed, a great client, and I love working with him. But it did make me smile because he said to me something like, "Oh, Chris, this podcast, I'm surprised that one didn't go down so well." And I went, well, did you ask the guest to share it? No, we didn't. I went, so it's all of these things where you have to think about the promotion of it as well, Cole, don't you?
I have a template email that I send on the Sunday with the links to the episode that's just gone live, thanking the guests for appearing, and then I share with them in a WeTransfer or Google Drive all the promotional content. So I have a promotional image, I have a promotional clips, and I'm tagging them across all the different platforms. And I mentioned that's what I'll be doing, and they can feel free to reshare with the audience if they think it would be of value, which I know it will be. Don't get me wrong, not every guest will share their stuff. For example, some guests will have very strict parameters on social media, but the vast majority of guests, if you produce good enough quality collateral to share, will put it out there to their audience. So take some time to do that properly as well. And then from there, you get to permeate their audience, they get to permeate yours, and there's that back and forth value transfer in that respect. Equally, I know many guests in terms of in my why me section, I will talk about the high quality clips I'll produce for their social media. If we record in a studio, I will give them the full video file that they can use. I had a guest in Dubai recently in March time, a guy called Joseph Rakic. He's got 750,000 followers on Instagram. He's like an OG of the online fitness space. He's clipped up my podcast into like 15 different clips. And he was like, that's me sorted for half a month because he posts every day. And I was like, okay, that's really cool. And that's a real value exchange. He came on my show, delivered value to my audience. I got to penetrate his audience, and people came across and they thought, oh, Colin talks about fitness and business to this guy. I'm going to go back and listen to other episodes. And guess what? His socials were popping with high quality video content from a studio in the middle of Dubai. Seriously good.
And to add on to that, we're going to need another round on this call. And to add on to that, of course, you've got then the ability to include that in your pitch email, because when you're just starting out your podcast and you don't have the numbers to quantify, there is some numbers that you can give them, which is, I'm going to give you 4 engaging clips from our conversation, which you can use on your social for free. So you can even just give them that. Cole, mate, thank you so much for your time. And I know that people can actually get more access to your podcasting knowledge now, can't they? I'm quite excited to learn more about this. Where can people tune into that side of Cole?
Yeah, of course. So in terms of actually listening to my own podcast, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you are, you can Google Cambro Conversations and you can listen to the episodes there. There's over 250 in the archive and one coming every single Sunday and occasionally a Wednesday as well. I did some consultancy work for people who were asking me, how do I start a podcast? Because once you start to prove the concept, of course, people are interested. Conversations like this one, for example, I had about 5 or 6 calls in mid-2023 with people just over Zoom, Teams, had a chat with them, understand. And only one of those people actually launched the show and kept at it. So what I've come to believe and what I've come to understand is those that pay attention because you have skin in the game. I could give away all the value I've given on this just now, Chris, and there'll be a small percentage of people who are in a particular set of circumstances where there's pain that they're running away from, or there's a goal that they're moving towards, where they will action it and they'll create a podcast and they'll use some of the systems that I've talked about. And the rest of the people, unless they pay something towards some sort of consultancy or some sort of course, they won't take action because they haven't actually got skin in the game and they haven't felt some sort of drive to go and do something. So I built out a video course called My Podcast Masterclass, which has 9 modules, 54 videos, and some templates, some copy and paste jobs, and some information that they can use to build out their own podcast. It's my systems, my processes, my outbounding stuff, my social media distribution channels, and how I've grown it from that perspective. And even some of the templates that I use for actually managing my flow of guests as well, which is obviously one of the most challenging things. That has been really, really helpful because of the participants, there's already 5 students who have launched their own podcast and have got to 10 episodes. So they've already smashed past that barrier of 8. And the number one reason for that is because they've got the processing systems, they had their why, but they also had the frameworks to rely on when things got hard or things got challenging. And of course, they paid a couple $100 and they were in a position where they were like, okay, I've invested in this. It's time for me to actually take this seriously. And it's been amazing to watch. One of the students has already had a couple of apprentice winners on. They've had people within their industry. They've won contracts from it. One of the guys is a property investor and he's had people invest in himself through in terms of deals because of the content he's been putting out there, has reached people and he's built that connection. So I really believe that podcasting is such a unique and valuable tool. It's still early. And if you start to build something valuable within your niche, it'll pay tenfold longer term, but also in terms of the network, the personal brand, all these things that really matter, the content creation, as you know, Chris, it really, really does pay off. So I'm super passionate about that. And that's available on Thinkific, and it's called mypodcastmasterclass.thinkific.com.
Mic drop. Cole, thank you so much for your time today, my friend. I really appreciate it.
Chris, my pleasure. We've gone full circle, and I'm sure we'll get a chance to speak again soon.
And thank you so much to everyone watching and listening, whether you're listening live or back. Let us know your thoughts and feelings. Drop us a comment, get involved in the conversation, subscribe to Reeve Social Media on YouTube. As always, a massive thank you to 𝗖𝗄𝗄𝗲𝗲, our official charity partner, and proudly sponsored by Hill Coaching Company. That's all for this week, and I will see you same time next week for another episode of A Coffee with Chris.